Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jessie Davis, the president of Kalamazoo Area Chapter of Wild Ones. If you are a member of the Kalamazoo Area Chapter of Wild Ones or would like to become one, please be sure to check out our website at kalamazoowild-ones.org, where you will find a link to our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. Be sure to check out the latest issue of the Seedlings newsletter that was emailed this week. At this point, I wish to pass it over to Tom Small, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessie. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. I've been on some committees with her and had considerable conversation with her over the course of the last couple of years since she's come to the Kalamazoo Nature Center and to the Kalamazoo area. And it's been a great pleasure for me. Jessica has a BA in biology from West Virginia University and an MS in natural resources with a specialty in forestry from the University of Michigan. She has served as a natural resources specialist for Southeast Michigan Resource Conservation and Development Council, where she was a project manager for state-funded forestry programs. She's one of the co-founders of the Cerulean Center in Northern Michigan, which has its mission to enhance the understanding of Great Lakes ecosystems. And she's also had her own consulting business, Verdant Stewardship, where she was involved in several urban forestry projects. At Kalamazoo Nature Center, where she is the Vice President for Conservation Stewardship, she's been involved in bird population studies and natural areas management projects. And her latest project has been a forest restoration project next to KNC's Sugar Shack. It's the first tree planting of scale, Jessica tells me, in several years, 60 trees, with an objective of recovering the forested area on KNC from losses due to emerald ash borer, to study effects of climate change on tree diversity, and to protect the cultural legacy of sugaring, and to study effects of climate change on sugar maples. There's been funding and support from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, from Pierce Cedar Creek Institute, Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy, and Fort Custer. Jessica brings a lot of energy, ideas, new and good old ones, and lots of field experience, lots of resources, lots of imagination, and a great deal of energy to her projects and to us tonight. And we're privileged to have her, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jessica Simons. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight, and I'm going to start sharing my screen now. And so tonight we are going to go into the forest, but more specifically into the forests here all around us. So tonight I want to give you an overview of urban forestry, why it is so important to us. It's a real passion of mine. And then to talk more specifically about some of the emerging research in the area and what we're learning about urban forests across the country, and then, even right here in Kalamazoo. So to get started, I always think it's helpful to talk to people about where are Michigan's forests. And I think if you ask most people that question, whether they're native Michiganders or whether they're tourists, I think most people would say up north, right? That's where most people think of Michigan's trees. And looking at the map here, I think most people would agree that most of the density of Michigan's 20 million acres of forest is located in the more northern parts of the state. And of course, it's really important for us. We have a legacy of forestry being a major part of our industry and a major natural resources focus for Michigan. And so, of course, those northern forests are beloved for us. But I think we also often fail to recognize the importance of urban forests. And so I got an interesting question from Tom when he said that when you started publicizing this talk, there were people who said, well, how would you even define an urban forest? Isn't that a bit of an oxymoron? Well, nationwide, 141 million acres of forests exist within cities and towns. You may think of that as what we have lining our streets, what we have in our backyards, and of course, those do make up our urban forests. It's also important to think of where people are these days in our country. As of the 2010 census, 81% of Americans live within urban centers, and we are becoming more urbanized with every passing year. And so, if we start to think of urban forests as the vegetation and wildlife, the habitats that are around the places where we live and work, we can recognize that forests do, in fact, live all around us and we are within them, if only we stop and notice it. And if we also then have that challenge to decide how much we want to be a part of helping those spaces to flourish. So here's one more view right here in Kalamazoo of where our urban forests take place. You might not really think of this as a forested area, but when you really start to look around, you can see how our urban forests extend beyond planted street trees and backyard trees. We really do have forested areas that are patchworks of our parks, of our areas alongside our waterways, even our abandoned spaces and gardens. So when we take the broad view, we realize that those green spaces make up a very important component of our communities. Taking a peek there at the Natural Features Protection Overlay map down in the corner, and seeing all of those areas lighted up in green, you can really see how Kalamazoo is starting to do a much better job of recognizing that those spaces have a real importance to the people here, and that it's really up to us to make sure that they're managed well and that they are protected. Finally, taking the most expansive view of urban forests, these are urban forests too. So on the left, here's a photo from Stewards of Kleinstuck. On the right, we can see a shot of Asylum Lake. We may not think of those as urban forests at like first glance, but they are. Those are also wild spaces within urban centers. And so when we're looking at the broader definition of trees in and around and among people, those absolutely count as well. So when we're looking at urban forests more generally, we actually know a lot about Michigan's urban forests. So the Michigan DNR has an urban and community forestry division. Pretty much every state across the country does as well. The USDA Farm Bill actually established the US Urban and Community Forestry Program that is usually delivered at the state level back in 1990. Actually, for the purposes of this presentation, I've tried looking up when Michigan's division started. I couldn't find that number, but let's guess it was probably around 1990. But since that time, Michigan has really dedicated staffing and resources to managing the state's urban forests. And within Michigan's urban areas and community centers, we have over 200 million trees. Now, the ranges of how dense those forested areas are in community varies considerably, anywhere from 5% canopy cover all the way up to 75%. But on average, our communities have about 30% of our community space that has closed canopy of tree cover. The national recommendation is to have a minimum of 40%. So really, we're not that far behind the recommendation that we even have of most best practices of urban forestry management organizations. And so Michigan's not doing too badly on this. Believe it or not, over a fifth of all of Michigan's trees actually exist within our towns and within our communities. So I want to take the next section of the presentation to really dig into the benefits. I'm sure that if I asked any one of you, you could rattle off many of the different benefits of having trees in our communities. And many of those benefits are very, very obvious. But some of them I think are a little more surprising. So I'd like to kind of go through those point by point. Speaking to this group, the first one isn't tough. Of course, having urban forests means that we have real benefits for our ecological health. It's these urban spaces that are green actually are ways to bring habitat into our communities, ways to create important connectivity between habitats that exist right outside of our urban centers, provides habitat for wildlife and supports native biodiversity. And so obviously our local ecology benefits when we have healthy urban forests. But believe it or not, we actually are really contributing to economic growth. There have been a tremendous number of studies over the years that look at the impacts to communities and the benefits to the actual growth in communities when we have trees. And so I ran across this wonderful literature review that looked across decades and looked at how we can see economics tied closely to the greening of our local spaces. And so home values go up when we have large trees. Home values go up when they're adjacent to parks. I mean, and some of these things seem intuitive, of course, like most people would say, of course they do. But believe it or not, even spending of shoppers goes up in shopping areas that have a tree canopy over them. People spend more time in urban centers where there are trees. So even just if you're looking at economics, it still makes good sense to have healthy green spaces. But as we're looking more at climate change and we're looking at how to create resilient communities, here is another place where our urban forests really matter. A lot more research is being done on how both communities can be better adapted to climate change because of their tree cover, and then how communities can actively help mitigate their carbon future by their tree cover. And so some of those things may, again, seem a little obvious. If you have neighborhoods with good tree canopy coverage, you actually can reduce the air temperatures in those neighborhoods. You have better stormwater management. You have reductions in flooding and reductions in erosion. Trees can play very important roles in our green infrastructure overall and can help communities be more resilient to flooding. And so we see a lot of benefits when we look at all of the climate risks that we're facing. Many of those risks can be abated if you have adequate tree canopy coverage in a neighborhood. According to studies that the Michigan DNR has published, Michigan's urban trees right now store over 33 million tons of carbon and sequester 900,000 tons every year. This is just our urban canopy. So whenever we talk about resilience as a state or talk about resilience in our communities, if we're not also looking at the urban tree component of that, we're really missing an important part of the picture. Another part of this that might not be quite as obvious right at first, when we talk about how urban trees can reduce air temperatures and reduce the heat island effect in communities, part of that means that an urban tree canopy also reduces the energy needs of local buildings. So it literally does not cost as much to heat and cool a building when you have adequate tree canopy coverage. And that has a lovely ripple effect when we're looking at climate resilience, because then we're lowering demand from utilities and even reducing that secondary level of greenhouse gas emissions because we are using less power generation as well, in addition to what the trees are doing on their own in terms of sequestration. So there's a remarkable amount of compounding benefit that really starts to take place. One of the things I wanted to mention related to climate resilience is that KNC is getting started right now on a brand new study. We are looking at our carbon storage within KNC's own forests. And we were very fortunate to just receive a grant from the Michigan DNR to take on this project. We're just getting started on it. But if you are particularly interested in that work, we'll actually be doing a presentation through KCCC in the Fridays for Future webinar on March 26th. And so be on the lookout for that. And if you want to get a deep dive about forest carbon and our work on that, you can hear more about that then. But trees also perform a wide range of other ecosystem services in our communities. So we've actually been able to quantify on a statewide basis the hundreds of thousands of gallons of stormwater runoff that just urban trees are managing within Michigan's communities. And the DNR estimates that 30,000 tons of air pollution is actually managed and cleaned through our urban tree canopy in the state at a value of over $600 million if you actually turn that into like a service number instead. What's pretty neat, I'll share some of the tools that different communities are using now to quantify some of these benefits, but one of the things that I think is really fun is that cities are actively using some of these numbers to, to kind of advertise what their trees are doing in communities, going as far as to put price tags on trees to show just how much benefit they bring in very real terms to their communities. Every single tree can have a remarkable benefit that we can actually get down to a dollar figure in terms of different kinds of services that they are providing. And that's beyond all of those more intangible benefits that, I think the folks participating tonight, know and love, but for people who are not as easily swayed about the value of trees in our communities, this is another way to reach them and to show some of the real benefits that we can receive. Some of the other kind of newer and more innovative ideas that people are using are doing intentional plantings of trees in contaminated sites as a phytoremediation program. We're using intentional plantings around green infrastructure, trying to actually think about their functional values in addition to things like just aesthetics and beauty, and also planting new urban forests as a food source within communities as part of overall food access trends. So there are a lot of nice ways that people are recognizing the services that trees can provide. We're also seeing over the years a tremendous amount of research that is happening around urban trees and human health. One of the most striking examples I've seen are really test studies that have happened right in Southeast Michigan. As Tom mentioned, I worked for years in Southeast Michigan, particularly around emerald ash borer response. And there have been some interesting human health studies that have taken place looking at communities that were hardest hit by the EAB outbreak, which was now been nearly 20 years ago. And they have literally seen higher instances of human mortality from cardiovascular and respiratory problems in communities where they had significant tree mortality versus nearby communities that did not have such a high ash population. And so we don't fully understand all the ways that human health is linked with the green spaces around us, but there are clearly deep interactions that we are just starting to recognize those connections, and where there's a tremendous amount of more work that needs to take place. The U.S. Forest Service does estimate, though, that at least 850 lives are saved every year just due to the pollution cleansing effects of urban forests in our country. And then finally, it's always worth mentioning that we have better mental health outcomes in green spaces. I think everybody here can agree that. We don't actually need a study to tell us that. And finally, among the benefits, this is where I get cheesy, but trees just make us happy. So the Arbor Day Foundation does a wonderful job of surveying people, particularly through their neighborhoods programs, where they're looking at the values that ordinary people place on the trees in their neighborhoods. 94% of people in their recent surveys believe that having trees in their community makes them happier. And the part that I want to call out, particularly for this group, is the huge amount of people who say that they are willing to support tree planting efforts with their own time and their own money. And I think that is good for us to recommend and us to recognize in our communities as we're doing our other advocacy work. People are waiting to be engaged, and they're waiting to have direction for how they can continue to improve green spaces in our communities. So how do we know all those facts? I just rattled off a whole lot of different things. There are a couple of key instruments that are used in the urban forestry world now. And the biggest and kind of flashiest of them is a program called iTree. It was primarily developed by the USDA Forest Service, but it's been done in partnership with a couple of large tree care private industry members. And basically, it's a fascinating computer-based inventory system that takes on the ground measurements where people can go out and tree to tree, measure their trees in their community, pair that with remote sensing data, and basically be able to quantify a lot of those same kind of figures that I had referenced in some earlier slides. So what that means in practice is if you have a community that has done an inventory, you know measurements about what species you have, you know what the size of those trees are and how big they are, how old they are in particular parts of your neighborhood, you can actually run it through these programs, and the algorithms will calculate how much those trees are contributing to energy efficiency reductions in local buildings. You can see how those trees are contributing to avoided runoff, or how they're contributing to better air quality in your community. And they're using these nationwide. This has been a program that has been developed over the last 2 decades, and they're really using it in very powerful ways. The city of Ann Arbor did a study like this using iTree back in 2013, and they've published the entire report online. It's pretty fascinating, but they were able to quantify for the people in their community to gain support for their urban forestry program, showing how Ann Arbor's urban trees contribute to over $3 million a year in pollution removal in the city, that they store $18 million a year worth of carbon, that they are saving buildings within their city $400,000 a year in energy costs. And so when you are at the budgetary level in a community, and everything's on the table, when you have numbers like this, you can make very compelling statements of support that go well beyond just saying we like trees, we think they're important, we think that they're good for birds. I trust me, those are all wonderful reasons for me. But for people who do not speak our language, these can be very, very compelling kinds of rationales to be able to share. There is, so not every community has been able to do a whole iTree assessment, but they have been able to do some more cursory values for pretty much anywhere across the US. If you go to the National Tree Benefit Calculator, I plugged in the numbers for the city of Kalamazoo. I chose a maple just because, well, they're everywhere. But you can put in any tree species at any size, and it's going to give you an estimate of the level of benefits that that single tree could provide in our community right here in terms of some of these common metrics that we're using, things like stormwater management or electricity uh, uh, reductions or improvements in air quality. And so a single 12-inch maple tree in the city of Kalamazoo would provide $130 worth of benefits in terms of property values and carbon storage. That's a single tree. So when you multiply that across a community, you can see the remarkable benefits that we can then articulate about what trees are offering in our community. One of the other main drivers of data that really pulls together some of these stories for us is the USDA Forest Service's Urban Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. FIA, or the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, has been around since the 1930s and is the way that we get longitudinal data about the US forests across the country. But up until just 2014, it was only focused in rural areas. And so it's been less than 10 years where we've started to pivot that system and to be able to deliberately monitor and record the health and the growth information about the trees in our urban areas. And so this is a pretty exciting development. You can see, looking at the map here, all of the communities where we have these FIA data sets popping up. And so Detroit was one of the earlier ones, Chicago was as well. And I'm hoping that we're going to start getting that FIA data collected here in Kalamazoo soon. Another one that I want to mention, and this is brand new, but a group called American Forests is working on the Tree Equity Score program. What you need to keep in mind, all of that data is great, we can recognize all of these benefits of urban trees. But the sad fact in our communities is that because of redlining, because of historical discrimination, the tree canopy in a city is not equitably shared across any given city. What we really see from city to city across the country is that that idea of a lush tree canopy that provides benefits to its residents is not available to all of the residents. And so what American Forest is doing through the Tree Equity Score program is they're taking that tree canopy data that we're seeing from these other tools, and they're meshing that in with important demographics information about what we're seeing in our communities. So we are able to take those tree numbers, tie that with information about employment, tie that with information about race, and then we're able to see how not only our trees are benefiting people in communities, but how people are not being served by those benefits equitably across any given city. So the city of Detroit was one of the first cities that was piloted for this. It's only been done in about a half cities across the country so far. But what they do is they literally break down that information at a block by block basis. And so I've highlighted here up in the corner, you can see that kind of little turquoise block that's lit up. There's an area here in Livonia that has a tree equity score of 100. So that's a perfect score for that particular neighborhood. The tree canopy there is 65% coverage of tree canopy. The goal for the whole Detroit area is only 48%. So they're already well exceeding that. The people of color in that community is 10%. There's only a 17% poverty rate and a 4% unemployment rate in that particular neighborhood. By contrast, here is another neighborhood in Ecorse. The existing tree canopy there is 0%. The percentage of people of color in that particular neighborhood is 79%. The poverty rate is 88%, and the unemployment rate 23%. And so what's fascinating about this particular project is we've now moved beyond just saying, are there trees in our communities? Are those trees healthy? And how can we manage them better? Now we're starting to look at broader questions of how we really reach the people in our cities and how we can prioritize where resources need to be spent and how we can do that more effectively. So what's nice about this particular program, their goal is to use it as a fundraising engine and as a prioritization engine to bring up the tree equity score in communities that are really being underserved. So with all of that data and all of those benefits, I need to at least blast through what are some key threats to urban forests. Sadly, I was looking for a terrible image to share. I Googled impervious surfaces. This is what you get. I think it's a pretty good example of unhealthy urban forests. One of the biggest problems we see in urban forestry is a lack of diversity. So obviously, as many of you well understand, a lack of diversity in any ecological system increases its vulnerability to threats, reduces health of that habitat, and really sets us up for failure, particularly in urban areas. You know, we saw generations ago as beautiful tree-lined streets full of lovely matched elm trees all succumbed to Dutch elm disease. Then the trend was to replant those with green ash, and we know how that worked out. So the lack of diversity in Michigan's forest is still a real problem. 45% of urban trees in Michigan belong to the genus Acer. Almost half are maples. So that right there is showing us that we have a real problem to overcome and a real educational hurdle to make sure that as we're doing plantings, we are intentionally diversifying what we have. Lack of investment is obviously a real problem as well. As cities are decreasing their budgets, we have competition in land uses with development. We just have poor management. That's a real threat to our urban forests. Something to keep in mind as large trees are cut down. Yes, many communities do have aggressive replanting programs in place or mandate that for every tree that is cut down, another one has to be replanted. Please keep in mind that the estimated average lifespan of a newly planted tree in an urban area is less than 30 years. So when you cut down a 150-year-old tree and replace it with a tree that is only expected to live 30 years, we are not replacing at a one-to-one level. And so what we see overall is that our canopy is still shrinking in urban areas. And so we deeply need to increase the investment in tree cover and to be looking at how we're investing in the health of our trees, the diversity of our trees, and expanding that tree coverage in a more equitable way. We also have a lot of forest health threats. I could talk about this part all day if we wanted, but urban areas, what might surprise you, are particularly threatened by forest pests. If you think about it, our global trade centers are in our urban areas. And so many of the forest health threats that are most damaging to our forests, things like emerald ash borer, spotted lanternfly, Asian longhorn beetle, those are coming in as a consequence of global trade. If you look at the history, emerald ash borer first arrived in Canton. The Asian longhorn beetle first arrived in the US in Brooklyn and in Chicago. And so when our monitoring programs historically only looked at traditional forests, we were missing the forest for the trees. And so luckily we have learned from that, and we are starting to incorporate more forest health monitoring programs in urban areas, trying to catch these problems that are often landing where people are before they have a chance to spread. We also have climate change as a major threat to our urban forests. One tool I want to recommend, I'm not going to go into this in much detail, but there's a website called forestadaptation.org that hosts the Adaptation Workbook that helps forest managers to look at all of their management priorities with the threats of climate change in mind, and to look at climate vulnerability and to figure out how to conduct their management plans so that they're actually looking, eyes wide open at climate change and its threats. We have been using some of these tools at KNC over the last couple of years, and we're trying to incorporate these kind of strategies into our own management plans, but they are now adapting these systems to apply in urban areas as well. And so there are some nice case studies on their website that I'd recommend. So that's a lot of priorities to balance, right? So we have to think about where it's feasible to plant, where people want trees, how we can do it in terms of money. There are some common themes that have really emerged that are commonly recommended management strategies that really, any urban forest manager is going to recommend for anywhere. Number one is looking at those canopy targets. So we've been talking about how the percentage of tree canopy can make a big difference in terms of benefits to a community. And so the state, through the Urban and Community Forestry Division, is looking at that. So you can see a map there of urban canopy throughout Michigan's communities. Kalamazoo is not doing so bad. We're right at 30 to 40%, so we're kind of hanging in there. But having an active management plan is another key part to having a well-managed, healthy forest. So there are a lot of elements to that. It's everything from having a tree inventory to making sure that you have a system to manage that data over time, having risk management plans, things like a tree board or a community advisory committee for your urban forests makes a huge difference in the support that you can get. And so all of those pieces play into a management plan. The state's also closely following this, looking at how they can incentivize communities putting management plans in place. And good news, Kalamazoo just was awarded one of the Michigan DNR grants this year and is conducting a new urban forest inventory. So that's great news for us. Good diversity and planting practices are important. So the 10-20-30 rule is one people like to throw out there. No more than 30% of the same family, no more than 20% of the same genus, no more than 10% of the same species within your whole community. That's a little bit of shorthand, but it is helpful in helping communities to understand that we need a wide diversity of trees. They need to be planted in the right place so that we are aware of the impacts of proximity to buildings and utility lines and all of those kinds of things. And obviously weighing heavily on the opinion of certified arborists makes a big difference in that work. As we keep kind of coming back to climate adaptation, Tom had referenced this in terms of work that we're doing at KNC, but as we're looking at diversity in our community trees, we now also have to look at climate resilience. And so again, that forest adaptation site is one I'd recommend. But what they are doing is they're literally putting out lists of native tree species and giving projections of how they are anticipated to thrive or decline under different climate change scenarios. So one of the things we're keeping in mind at KNC when we're doing planting projects is trying to weight our diversity a little bit heavier on trees that are expected to thrive under the high climate change conditions that are projected for our area. And so it is one more complicating factor, but it is a real one that people really need to consider with any kind of planting projects that are taking place now. One quick one that I want to reference that you may not think of in terms of urban forest benefits and opportunities is the idea of urban wood recovery. The photo here is a library in Ann Arbor where they literally harvested dead ash trees from the development site where the building was going in and repurposed those trees right in the same facility. And so in terms of sustainability, in terms of local use and in waste recovery, the idea of taking urban trees, recovering those and turning them into sustainable products to be used right within the community and to be used as a job generation opportunity in communities is another often unanticipated benefit of urban forests. I wanted to give a little shout out to the city of Kalamazoo because the Natural Features Protection Ordinance is a great example of innovative care of our urban forests. We have both a tree and a woodland standard within the ordinance, and in different ways, each of those protect trees due to their size, due to their species, and restrict the removal. It also requires some replacement. And so it puts some standards in place about what kind of trees are acceptable and how the diversity levels need to be maintained for any replacements that go in. And so there aren't too many communities that have a protection ordinance in place like that. And so I think Kalamazoo is really doing a lovely job of leading the way with this initiative. So I want to wrap up. I know I don't have too much time left, but I wanted to offer a couple of resources. I've gone very quickly through many of these topics, but there are a couple of great sites that I highly recommend if you are interested in learning more about urban forestry and about some of the recommendations that are in place. Far and away, the site number one, if you only go to one place, I would recommend it be the Vibrant Cities Lab website. That is a project, again, of the USDA Forest Service, but they are doing a phenomenal job of making this a clearinghouse of information around urban forestry and how communities can really build support for their urban forests and strengthen their own management plans. And so the website is geared in two different directions overall. One, it's a repository for research. So if you are looking for information about the contributions that urban forests can make in any of these areas, you can just go to this website. It will navigate through different current research. It goes through case studies of what different cities are trying. It's a nice spot for seeing the kind of experimentation that's happening across the country around a lot of these different concepts. And then secondly, it has a toolkit. So for any city that is looking at their own urban forest management plan, trying to decide how to either build a plan for the first time, how to modernize their plan, or how to really just make sure they're following best practices, this is a great place to go for guidance. It can walk you step by step through all of those different elements of a strong plan, and again, give good examples of what leading communities across the country are doing in these different areas. A longstanding program that I also think is worth mentioning is the Tree City USA program. Many people don't even notice it anymore. It's been around so long. Kalamazoo even has been a Tree City USA member for nearly 30 years. But Tree City USA does a great job of raising the profile of urban forestry. And they also have a lot of standards that are in place. So in order to become a Tree City USA member, and in order to retain that membership, you do have to have certain minimum standards about how your management takes place. And so it's another good one worth mentioning. And then finally, the Michigan Department of Natural Resources does have their Urban and Community Forestry Division. They have a weekly email newsletter. It's not flashy. Among all these different resources that are out there, this is just an e-newsletter, but it's a really good one. There's hardly a week that goes by that I don't find something in there, whether it's a link to a new research report that's come out, or whether it's a link to a grant program. We have managed to get funding right at KNC because of links that I have found through this weekly newsletter. So it's one I recommend, and you can find the link right there at the bottom, michigan.gov/UCF to sign up. And that's it. So I appreciate the chance to talk about one of my favorite things in the world. I could talk forever about urban trees, but I welcome any questions from you. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you this evening.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, or Jessica. I don't think that we'll look at our neighborhoods the same anymore. I'm going to go out and I'm going to notice all the trees that are there and just how much diversity is there and how many trees are there and what size are they. So this has given us lots of good food for thought. We've had a couple of questions come in on the chat. And the first one was about the Vibrant Cities.
Vibrant Cities Lab?
Yeah, that you put up. And so that showed, urban forests, what do they provide us in terms of resources or benefits? And so human health was mentioned, water quality, etc. One thing that wasn't on there was, maybe we missed it, biodiversity. So supporting biodiversity.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that is kind of surprising that is not that's not listed among there. I will say I can flip back. Here we go. I do know that is something that is incorporated within the iTree model. And so
I did see it back there.
Let me go back to that one really quick. So here we go. So I'm not saying that the Vibrant Cities Lab wouldn't have any biodiversity information. It's very possible that it does. I don't know why that's not highlighted as one of the key topics, but as you can see here, basically once something makes it into iTree, it is pretty commonly held as one of the key emerging issues that is of concern to communities across the country. This tool has been developing and evolving for years. And so just the fact that the whole terrestrial section of iTree is addressing things like biodiversity, invasive plants, habitat, this is a great outgrowth of the tool. I've been watching the development of these kinds of models for a lot of years now. And they really started with a lot of the more economically tied benefits. And I think that the rationale for that was simply that it was primarily being used in its early years as a tool to fight for urban forestry and city budgets. And so when they were trying to go head to head with other departments about about cost savings, I think it was much easier to do that when they were focusing on things like water quality and stormwater management and building energy use. And so I think that's why those things were prioritized first. But these tools are getting more robust all the time. And I think that it's clearly a great development that we're starting to finally acknowledge the need to measure and quantify the impacts on some of the more ecologically minded benefits as well.
Yeah, I've just been reading Bringing Nature Home, Doug Ptolemy, and just thinking about planting natives that will support the biodiversity is really important. So we had a second question that had, how do we advocate for native trees over ornamentals like Bradford pear? Somebody else chimed in and said that in Kalamazoo, they're advocated for in the master plan through the Natural Features Protection Overlay.
They are, and we did have very specific lists in the Natural Features Plan of what kinds of trees were preferential, both in terms of what what they could and couldn't remove and what they did and did not have to replace it with. It's funny that you mentioned Bradford pear, because I flipped to this slide really quickly. I was trying to find an image that captured some of the different elements of planting the right tree in the right place, but I was horrified that if you look down in the bottom, in the center, one of the trees listed there was a Bradford pear, and I made a point to just draw a line through it. But you're right that we do need to make sure that as plans and prescriptions are made in our community, that they are done thoughtfully, and that we really are having the right people giving input to shaping those plans. And so what I would love to see is for Kalamazoo to have a tree board, for us to have a citizen group. Oh, I see Sharon raising her hand.
Yes.
We have one.
We do?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
I posted that in the chat too. I could talk about it for a
excellent.
second. I
Yes, please do.
follow it every once in a while, but if you guys follow the City of Kalamazoo Facebook and YouTube, they do all of their meetings live, and it's a board, so it's a tree committee. There's one person who's also on the Environmental Concerns Committee on there, and they basically discuss within the city limits the different trees. Also, side note, City of Kalamazoo has done a GIS mapping of each neighborhood and the percentage of tree canopy in each neighborhood. And via the planting that's happening that they got approved, they are planting trees in the 3 neighborhoods that had the least amount of tree canopy to start, at least. So,
Pleased to hear that. And I did not realize that there was a separate tree committee already in place. So I am thrilled to hear that. And those are the folks that really we need to make sure that they are advocating for the kind of diversity we need.
And I see Gail Walter posted in the chat too, and she's with us, and she's on the tree committee.
Wonderful. Oh, that's great to know that Gail's on that. Okay, good.
So maybe between you and some of the others that follow the tree committee, so how do we advocate for natives? So in Kalamazoo, we've got a tree committee, but there's someone here from Grand Rapids who's on the urban forest project there, and says, how do you convince them to plant more native trees?
Oh, it's a good question. And meanwhile, I so admire the work of the Grand Rapids of the forest, the Friends of the Urban Forest there. I think they're doing great work, and they're doing some really innovative stuff that's fun to follow. I think much like anything else, we just have to keep speaking up. But I also think that to some degree, we need to take advantage of some of these tools that are out there as well. We are seeing over and over again that native forests, diverse forests, are resilient forests, and that they can support more enhanced biodiversity in our communities. And I think we just need to have a shared voice over it. I mean, and it's hard because there is a real tension in the urban forestry world. So much of it is so closely tied with horticulture. And so we do have such a push for specific variants of species that are more tied to urban conditions. And that's a hard thing to break. But I couldn't agree more that we need to see more natives in our plantings.
And another question that was asked about the tree committee was, does the City of Kalamazoo Tree Committee have authority in public areas, or only, or does it also oversee private property? And I see Gail posted that that the tree committee can only address city trees, so those in public spaces, I guess. But yeah, how would we get the word out to private property owners, and try to convince them to plant more natives?
Well, see, that is truly why the public relations piece is really important. When I was talking about the elements of a good management plan, it's funny, you wouldn't think of it necessarily right at first, but having a vehicle and a plan for outreach is critically important to any urban forestry program, and its longevity and its health, because you do ultimately need to have your public on board. You need to have people advocating for your urban trees, you need to have people advocating for best practices, and you need to have ways that you can engage private landowners, because when you're looking at the overall scope of an urban forest, yes, there is the proportion that the municipality controls and can manage and has responsibility for. But when we're looking at total impact, we are looking at this huge matrix of public and private ownership, all intermixed in a shared space. And where we really see transformation is if we're able to bring the public along in those kinds of changes, where we have the public commonly understanding that, oh, we do want to favor native species. We do want people to put more trees in their yards. We do want to advocate away from manicured lawns. I mean, all of the things that Wild Ones is doing already. There's an element to that same kind of outreach and that same kind of advocacy when talking with the public about what we hope people will do with their own tree canopy.
Mhm. And perhaps tying that into the value of native trees to supporting the insects that feed on the trees, and the insects are food for the birds, and so it's not just planting a native for native sake, but it supports so much else.
Absolutely. And even, even in the discussion about pollinators, it's funny, I tried digging up data on this and I didn't have any luck in time for this presentation, but I heard a presentation from one of the pollinator research labs at MSU a couple of years ago, and they were talking about the shockingly high dependence that many of our native pollinators have on just tree pollination. So, I mean, when you think of the primary species that pollinators are working off of, for some reason, everyone's picturing prairies all the time, but you don't really think about the role that black cherry trees play, or the role that tulip poplars play. And so that's really another whole area that we could get into, but it really makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
Well,
You
excuse me.
go ahead, Tom.
One of the tools that people can use is the work of Doug Tallamy, who had uh, great research figures on the value of native trees and shrubs and understory trees, all for the native pollinators, particularly the Lepidoptera, but also for the native bees. And you're absolutely right, Jessica and Anne. People who are interested even in native plant gardening don't always realize how important the tree and shrub levels for pollination and for wildlife. They're the key, really, to the whole of the ecosystem. And an urban forest has to consist not just of the tree canopy, but of a native tree diversity and also the other levels
Yes.
of a true forest.
Yes.
Not just a canopy. It's all the niches, and they're all so important for our pollinators and for our wildlife who are under such stress. Many of the studies now suggest that as much as 75% of our insect species, our insect biomass, has been eliminated in the last 40 years. That's just not sustainable. We have to persuade people that it is very important how much they plant, where they plant it, and what the diversity of what they plant, how important that is.
Absolutely. Jessica, there was one statistic you threw out that said that replacement trees, the average life expectancy is 30 years. Can you just say a little bit more? 30 years? That seems kind of short.
It does seem short, but I've been to a lot of arboricultural conferences over the years, and what we don't tend to realize, and what we tend to gloss over, and this is one of those moments where I hope that you'll look with different eyes as you go around the community, especially this spring. But when we think of our urban trees, we think of our large stately, the large stately trees we pass time and time again, you know, on the block or on the corner near the park. When we look at an urban forest as a whole, start to pay attention to the sheer number of trees that are planted alongside parking lots or planted in the landscaping in front of a new commercial building. And once you look at those numbers and you see just how many trees are planted, pay attention to those trees, those ones that are getting constant salt damage, the ones that are getting hit by mowers every day. The lifespan of those and the sheer amount of stress that they undergo in their own microclimates, whether that's due to soil compaction, whether that's due to any number of disturbances, the longevity of those trees is incredibly short. And sadly, many people, even when there are planting standards in place, or maybe especially when there are planting standards around development where they're told that they have to put in so many trees into a new development site, they just pop in these little spindly lollipops and 5 years later, those trees are gone. And maybe the ordinances say they have to plant again. So then they put in more. And 5 years later, those trees are gone because they're never properly cared for. And so when we look at overall replanting rates and longevity rates, the sheer number of all of those trees brings the average down dramatically because so many of the trees that are planted in urban areas really never have a chance to even get into an upper canopy.
So I'm just going to thank you once more, Jessica. That was fascinating. And we will pay more attention to our trees and advocate for more native trees in our neighborhoods and in the urban areas. And I'll turn it over to Jesse to close out the meeting. And I've put a slide up for our next meeting in March.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Anne. I wish to thank everyone for joining us today, and I wish to thank Jessica for her great presentation. It was very much appreciated, and I learned a lot, that's for sure. I want to point out that our next meeting will be March 24th, Wednesday. The presenter will be Tom Small, our own Tom Small, and it will be on the beauty of spring ephemerals and their place in the sun, which will be a perfect topic in March when they're all coming up. I hope you are able to join us. Once again, please go to our website if you're looking to find more information about our chapter and to become members. Also, don't forget, you will be able to find this presentation and others at our YouTube channel, which can also be linked through our website. Thank you very much. Have a great night.